Uh, my name is Alan Nazaro, and I'm the program manager for disaster recovery services at RCAC. And how many of you are familiar with RCAC? The Rural Community Assistance Corporation. We're a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution designated by IRS. And we get funding from them, and we have a robust loan fund program. We also do community development work. We have a community and environmental group that does water and wastewater, and also some solid waste disposal assistance for rural and indigenous communities. And we have a robust housing program, which we do USDA self-help. We have housing council. We're a housing counseling training agency for HUD nationally. So we do it all over the country. We have a development solutions group, which helps partner with rural communities to do affordable housing. And DRS, the Disaster Recovery Services, is part of housing because that's where I started at RCAC. We also have a building rural economies program. So when I came to RCAC back in 2020, just before the pandemic, I was brought into the housing department because I have affordable housing development experience. I used to work for HUD, so I know all of HUD's programs. And I also used to work for FEMA. And because I worked for FEMA, the first assignment I was given was to assist with the campfire recovery in Paradise, Butte County, California. And I've been working there ever since. When I started working in Paradise, I noticed that our C&E people were there helping with water and wastewater issues because everything was destroyed after the fire, and there was a lot of issues. As a matter of fact, a town of 26,000 people had no water. They had a water system, but no sewer system. It was everything for the town was on septic systems and leach fields. So they're looking at that now. And there were other parts of our company that were doing things, but we didn't know that each other were there. And so I approached my managers and I said, if we could coordinate our efforts, we could be more effective in helping people with recovery. And I said that, with economic development, with some utility and the finance people that we have and the housing, we have all the elements or most of the elements that FEMA would put into the field to help communities after a disaster. I worked in community recovery assistance for all the years I was with FEMA. And that's what we would do. We would put teams in the field that specialized in all those different areas and help the communities organize and figure out how they were going to recover in each of those areas, because each area is very important to the recovery of a community. So that's how we formed a committee. We did a report about all the work we were doing, all the work we could do, and how much better we could do if it was coordinated. And so we presented that to the board. They asked us to do a business plan, and the disaster recovery service program was initiated after that with the help of a grant from Mackenzie Scott. We were one of the first organizations nationwide that received a large grant from her group. Next slide, please. As I said, because of my FEMA experience, I was assigned to work in Paradise. And next slide, please. And I'm not sure if you know about the campfire, but 90% of the town of Paradise was destroyed by the fire. The town of Paradise grew up without zoning and without planning. It grew up haphazardly over a 100-year period. And because of that, they had a lot of long dead-end streets. They had isolated areas. And it's because of those long dead-end streets and those unreachable areas is one of the reasons, well, the speed of the fire that came through and those long dead-end streets caused the 85 deaths in the community. And, you know, there were 30 some odd number of mobile home parks that were a good portion of the affordable housing in the area. Most of those parks were totally destroyed, and they're lucky now if there's 8 or more that have come back, and most of those have come back from market rate developers, because the people that ran those parks were mom and pop operations and they didn't have the resources. And a lot of people don't know this, but FEMA does not help private businesses. So if you're a private property owner who runs a mobile home park, you're not going to get any help from FEMA. You might be able to get SBA loans, but there's no grant programs to help private industry come back after a disaster. And that's why it's also important to have economic development people work on a disaster. Next slide, please. So we had a saying in FEMA that all disasters begin and end locally. And the level of impact and the amount of resources needed and the length of time that it takes for recovery, you know, all are factors that combine to amplify the impacts and the stress and trauma on the community. How each community reacts and responds to the situation determines the future of the community. And you could see that Paradise was just overwhelmed by the fire that happened. And even though they had preparation, they had a preparedness plan, the speed and ferocity of the fire just overwhelmed everything that they had. Next slide, please. Sure. Yes. Yes. The question was, there was a map that showed a bunch of dots, and were those the homes and businesses that were destroyed? And yes, like I said, 90% of the town was destroyed. I think there were maybe 1,200 structures that were left in the entire town. Yes, yes. Yes, I did say all disasters begin and end locally, because what happens is when a disaster of that magnitude comes in, you'll get a presidential declaration, and FEMA and a bunch of other federal agencies, state agencies will come in, but they're not there forever. FEMA's only there for 18 months, 2 years maybe, and the state may be there longer, but it all comes down to what the community does for itself in the long run, because every disaster or disaster recovery is a marathon. It's not a sprint. One of the first disasters I worked on was Katrina down in Louisiana, and New Orleans has never recovered the total population they had before Katrina. And you know, they're still rebuilding. So it takes years and decades sometimes, depending upon how devastating the disaster is. The town of Paradise right now only has about maybe 30% of the population they had before the fire. And they're talking about limiting how that's going to be. But again, the whole idea of climate awareness and rebuilding, we had another saying at FEMA: you always want to build back better and stronger. You don't want to build back to the same standard that you were before the disaster. The town of Paradise really took this to heart, and they took a very positive and path forward. They have adopted does everyone know what IBHS is? It's the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And they're the people that have the wind tunnels and they burn houses down to show how certain things happen in a fire or in a hurricane. And they do all these tests and they come up with standards to mitigate against disasters. Well, after the fire, the campfire, the IBHS came up with what they called wildfire prepared home standards. And I call it common sense kind of things. It's having a Class A fire resistant roof. It's having amber proof vents on your attics and other areas. It's having a 5-foot perimeter around your home that is non-combustible. It can be rock, stone, but no plants and nothing combustible. And if you do have a deck off your house, then you have to make sure that underneath the deck is clear and there's no growth under there. And it's, you know, fireproof as much as it can be. Also, you have if you have regular siding, there has to be a 6-inch clearance from the ground to the bottom of the siding of non-combustible areas. So exposed concrete foundation would be preferable. And no fencing comes up to the house. It can't come within, combustible fencing can't touch the house or can't come within 5 feet of the house. And then you need to maintain your property. And so the town of Paradise adopted those standards. They adopted property maintenance standards, and they're instituting some internal fire breaks or buffers throughout the town. And they're also working with the Paradise Regional Recreation and Parks District to look at buffer zones around the town to, you know, have a break for wildfire. They're also, as I said before, they never had a sewer system, but they're looking at a centralized sewer system along the 2 main commercial corridors in the town. And they want to try to concentrate development, especially any multifamily development in the areas closest to those new sewer lines and away from. The town of Paradise is on a ridge about 1,000 feet above Chico, California, which is down the hill. And the fire came from the canyons up the ridge walls and was swept over the town. So they want to try and keep development away from the ridge edge and concentrate it where it's more defensible. So, and the other thing they did is they got an FHWA grant to connect all of those dead-end cul-de-sacs or long dead-end roads together to the grid system so that they have better egress from future disasters. So they are taking this really to heart, and they're really becoming the poster child for how to work against future disasters by mitigating. Next slide, please. Sure. Federal Highway Administration. So this is just an illustration of what I was talking about before. You can see the rock and stone around the house. Concrete driveway serves that purpose. The property is maintained, and it has all those features that I talked about. And you know, it's especially important that properties be maintained because it's that dead weeds and ladder fuels that really make a fire more combustible. And we'll talk about how fires enter communities in a little bit. Next slide, please. The wildfire risk reduction buffer zones is a concept that was studied because of the campfire I mean, it's been studied before, but this was a study undertaken by the Nature Conservancy and a consulting group. I believe they were out of Portland, CBI. And they identified 35,000 acres around the town that could be part of a buffer zone that would totally protect the town. The problem with that is that, first of all, to acquire either outright by fee title or easement would be enormously expensive for 35,000 acres. And by current standards, it's estimated that to maintain ladder fuels would be $1,500 per acre per year is a rough estimate. So at that rate, 35,000 acres, if you were maintaining that, would be over $52 million a year, which no rural town and no rural county can afford. So we were looking for more effective and efficient systems to implement the buffer zones, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. I already mentioned the fact that the original study identified approximately 35,000 acres. And just even to acquire on the map, the fire came from the east of Paradise. So just to acquire the eastern buffer zone was estimated to be at a minimum $40 million just to acquire that. So you can imagine how much it would cost to do the entire thing. Which brings us to next slide. Our current work, as I said, I've been working in Paradise for 3.5 years, and we have a TA team that's made up of insurance experts in the field of catastrophe modeling, actuarial modeling, and just financing. And we brought this team together because I don't know if it's happening. It's probably happening here in Oregon, but it's happened in California, Colorado. It's happened in Florida because of hurricanes, but the insurance companies are pulling out of California at a rapid rate, or they've increased their insurance rates by an astronomical amount so that it becomes unaffordable for anyone to rebuild. And the reason that the town is only at 30% now is because most of that 30% that have come back are people that can afford the increase in insurance and could afford the post-COVID construction costs that were skyrocketing as well. So what we're doing now we have the Parks and Recs District has a grant from FEMA, a BRIC grant, which is Building Resilient Communities and Infrastructure, and it's a mitigation grant, and it's to figure out an implementation plan for the buffer zones. And we added a new company to our TA team, Toyon LLC, which came up with a fire pathways model. And with these three models, we hope to figure out a cost-effective way to implement the buffer zones that will convince the insurance companies that the town is safer and insurable. The problem being too that if only Paradise does it, the insurance companies are not going to rush back into California because they're going to want to see geographic diversity in their clients. So we have to convince more communities to adapt these same standards and start to mitigate. Next slide, please. So the fire pathways model identifies the areas most likely to support rapid fire spread rates and high fire line intensity as a fire approaches a community. You know, when you look at a wildfire on the news, you see people driving through walls of fire on either side and everything is engulfed in flames. Fires do not start that way. As you can see from this illustration, fires take they're kind of like water. They take the path of least resistance. For a fire, that's the path with the most ladder fuels, and depending on the prevailing winds and soil conditions, and fuel. Those are the main three things. This model figures out what pathways the fires are going to take as they approach the community. And if we can identify those areas, and if we can get those areas maintained, the theory is that 20%, possibly 20% of an overall buffer zone maintained adequately can give 80 to 90% of the risk reduction benefit. And once, next slide, please. Once we have those, then the catastrophe model tells us where the fire is going to enter the town and what parts of the town need to be hardened, and can give us the average annual losses that can be expected based upon the buildings in the town and the direction of the fire and how fast it's moving. And you know, we have to characterize the structures in the environment in the study area. And then they run the built environment through the customized wildfire models that were built by CoreLogic, who was our TA model consultant for catastrophe modeling. Next slide, please. Then our Milliman and Associates, our other TA partner, does the actuarial modeling to show what the using the average annual loss, AAL, developed from the two previous models, what kind of savings that would be for risk reduction. And in our previous study that we were doing with the town that was funded by the Bay Area Foundation, we found that if the town, which they are doing, implements all that suite of mitigation projects, policies, and programs that I was describing earlier to the fullest extent, and they get anywhere from 75 to 100% compliance, then the risk of wildfire can be reduced by as much as 80%. So that's incredible numbers. And if we can get enough communities to do that, then maybe we can get the insurance companies to stick around and lower their rates. And that's one of the things that we're trying to come up with. Yes. Compliance with all of the mitigation policies and programs. And we really feel, like I said, they implemented the IBHS wildfire prepared home standards as their building code. So, and 90% of the town was destroyed. So every building built from July 2022 on is going to meet that standard. So, and they also got a grant from FEMA to do retrofits on some of the homes that survived the fire. With that rate and the rate of growth, we feel it'll be easy for the town to reach that 75% compliance on that side, and then putting in fire breaks, internal fire breaks. A little anecdote from Paradise. One of the reasons the Parks District is so involved with the buffer zone idea is because there's a park in Paradise that it's a beautiful park, has big trees and grassy areas, and it has a pavilion with a metal roof in the middle that people use for weddings, and it can hold a couple hundred people. During the fire, people that could not get out of the town, about 185 people congregated under that metal structure and survived. And the park had some burn damage on some of the trees, but the park was mainly untouched. And same thing on the eastern side of the town, there was an orchard, and all the buildings on the east side of the orchard where the fire was coming from were destroyed. Everything on the west side of the orchard was saved because the orchard is irrigated and maintained, and it served as a fire break. So the idea of having either agricultural or parks and open space that are maintained can serve as fire breaks and refuges during a fire. %80 risk reduction for a future fire. So the question was the 75% compliance with the mitigation policies, programs, and projects would give 80% risk reduction from a future wildfire. Next slide, please. So it takes a community. We always say this in FEMA when we were doing disaster recovery. It takes the whole community to recover from a disaster. And in wildfire, this is amplified because wildfire is an all or nothing approach. You can't have a home that is maintained and has all the fire breaks and fire resistant construction right next to a home that has weeds throughout the property, is falling apart, and has wood stacked up against the house. It's just, you can't have that and survive. It's going to spread the fire from home to home. So it really takes a good commitment, and that's the kind of commitment that the town of Paradise is doing, and the kind of commitment that we need to get from other communities throughout the state. And our wildfire pathways model is being used by other communities for the same purpose. And we hope to get a group of communities together and start to talk to the insurance companies about, kind of a group insurance policy for those communities that are compliant. But that's down the road after we get this work done. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the BRIC grant that we received, or that the Parks District received from FEMA, was insufficient to do an adequate implementation plan for the buffer zones, because we need property appraisals, we need the specific parcels identified and appraised, we need cooperation from the landowners. It's going to take a lot of effort, and then we also need a lot more community engagement, which is what we're going to be doing down as part of this study and in the future. So we're actually applying to the state of California for additional funding to do all those other things, so that we can get the entire plan implemented. And the neat thing about the fire pathways is once we identify those parcels, the other thing that the Regional Recreation and Parks District wants to do, and is part of the plan, is to connect those areas with trails for a dual purpose of recreational access for people in the canyon, but also those trails will be wide enough to serve a dual purpose of getting fire equipment from one area to another. And also they are wide enough to be a fire break in and of themselves. So, there's multiple purposes for those trails. And that's part of the implementation plan. And again, that's going to take more time to plan that out. And we're going to need some help down the road with some recreational planning. Next slide, please. So that's the situation in Paradise. And one of the reasons we were working in Paradise is because our CAC, rural is in our name, but it's also in our DNA. And we only work with rural and indigenous communities. And we started in California. Our headquarters is in Sacramento. And so we have a long-standing relationship with a lot of different communities and tribes in California. But we serve the 13 Western United States and Pacific Islands. As a matter of fact, we just got a grant to do a disaster recovery plan for Guam from the typhoon that hit there a few months ago. So we have a wide area, service area that we do work in. And we've established really good working relationships, one of which is in Mora, New Mexico. We've been there for 30 plus years, working on economic recovery issues, water and wastewater issues. One thing that our community and environmental people try to do in rural areas is do regionalization of water and wastewater systems, try to get small systems to work together for economies of scale. And it's been pretty successful, and New Mexico is a place where they're really pushing that idea. So we've been there a long time, and we have people on the ground. And because of our longstanding relationship, in 2022, there was a wildfire that happened to be caused by the U.S. Forest Service because they tried to prescribe burn that got out of hand. And it swept through 3 counties, and a lot of the national forest was just destroyed. And the national forest was livelihood for a lot of people in Mora County because they used the fire. There were firewood companies and just logging companies, and it's an agricultural basis in that community, in that valley anyway. And then immediately after, about a month or two after the fires, there were torrential rains that caused flooding and through the burn scar areas. And so it's a big item now for them moving forward is water testing, because all of their systems were inundated, private wells were inundated. They have acequias, which are irrigation ditches that were hand-built in the 1800s and upgraded over the years, but those were just totally filled with mud and debris from the floods. So there's a lot of issues that have to be resolved down there. And they came to RCAC because we're a trusted entity, and they asked us what we can do. So we repurposed a couple of grants, one from HUD, and then we got a grant from USDA so that we could start the planning process down there. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can really see on this, but the forest is just totally destroyed from the fire. Next slide, please. And the floods just really wiped out people's farms, ranches, and homes. We took a tour, and there were boulders the size of trucks that went through barns and houses, and it was a real mess down there. Next slide, please. So again, what we're working with, and the whole reason that RCAC got into the disaster recovery business is because our board, who represent rural communities throughout the Western United States, realized the same thing that we showed them in our report, is that our rural and indigenous communities have the least capacity to prepare for, mitigate against, or respond to, or recover from disasters. And they're disproportionately impacted by these disasters. And, and that's a situation. When I worked for FEMA, all the planning that I helped do for disaster recovery mainly was in rural communities because of those situations. They had no capacity to handle this. And what we really try to do is, recovery is both short-term and long-term, mostly long-term, but you have to, in the short term, you have to get people organized and get things ready, and get people thinking about recovery rather than thinking about what just happened to them. because if you can get them looking forward and thinking about the future and building back better and stronger, then that gives them some hope for the future. And that's what we try to do. Next slide, please. As you can see, this is a FEMA diagram, the 3-hump camel, as we used to call it, where short-term response is life safety issues. Medium term is temporary housing and sheltering for people for a period of time until they can start to rebuild. And as you can see, the long but shallower hill on this chart is long-term recovery, and it can go on for years, and it often does. But if the community is not organized and ready to take on the responsibility, once FEMA leaves, then they're going to be pretty much dead in the water. Next slide, please. So what we try to do is whole community engagement, meeting people where they're at, getting businesses and stakeholders involved, and churches and local foundations, and just everyone in the community. And as I said earlier, it's a holistic cross-discipline approach, because you have to, and you all know this being in affordable housing, you can't have housing without infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't do you any good if you don't have a community. So you need that all-encompassing approach, and you have to have an emphasis on resilience and sustainability, because like I said, you can't be building back the same way you were before and expect for different results. So we use these principles, and we try to get the local government and community buy-in and leveraging resources. Once you get a community organized, and if you can get them to do the planning necessary, a lot of funders look for the community buy-in. They look for a specific plan, and they want to make sure that their money is going to be well spent. So that's why these principles are so important. Next slide, please. As I said, getting organized is the first step, and I've always been amazed at the amount of knowledge, experience, and resourcefulness there are in rural communities that I've worked with. In Mora, we've got a community college, a university, we've got researchers, we've got utility folks, we've got just interested citizens, we've got some county government folks, and we had to work around people's schedules, because in an agricultural community, people do not like to meet on a weeknight. So we had to do our workshops on the weekends. And once we did that, we started getting 40 and 50 people showing up for working groups. And we divided them up into working groups to meet the needs. The first thing is developing a vision of what people want the community to look like down the road, 5 or 10 years down the road, and then coming up with strategies and actions and the priorities needed to meet those goals and visions and to get you there. And then updating is always important, because things change. If Mora had started right after the wildfires, they would have been just thinking about wildfire, and then the floods came. So things change, and you need to adapt to what the most prevalent risk is at the time. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of team approach that we used to use at FEMA. And one of the reasons I left FEMA was because they were starting to get away from this. But this is a really good way to organize a community into the different needs, based on the recovery. And this is just a suggestion, because you have to work with the community with however many resources they have and the experience and knowledge that they have. In Mora, we have these represented, but they're represented in 3 large committees that also work on other things. We have a housing, economic development, and infrastructure committee, but they also work on the cultural issues, health and social services. Different people in those groups work on those issues. They're all doing the community planning and outreach. In New Mexico, next slide, please. FEMA came in, and the state of New Mexico and FEMA came in, and this is always bugs me, but they kind of take a top-down approach instead of a community-up approach. And, oh, did you? After Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, FEMA came up with because of the complexity of the Puerto Rican government, FEMA had to adapt their efforts in recovery of Puerto Rico, and they came up with this lines of effort model. And they just had, infrastructure, economic, housing, and a bunch of others that were related to the work, the way that the Puerto Rican government is set up. And so New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, it doesn't have as complex but they don't have capacity. So they set up in this same thing, and they have consultants helping them fill in the gaps. So we had to adapt our committees so that we could better align with the state and FEMA effort. And once we did that, then the state people started showing up and FEMA people started showing up at our workshops and working more closely with us. The other thing that's different about Mora is because the Forest Service created the issue, Congress passed a special appropriation of almost $4 billion that is supposed to not have as many strings attached to it, and is supposed to make the communities that were impacted whole, but we'll see how that works out. That money still isn't hitting the ground yet. They're still trying to figure that out. Next slide, please. So, next slide. So we did get another grant from PRT and through FAHI, back the national nonprofit, to continue the work with Mora. And what we're trying to do now is to make sure that the committees meet on a regular basis and they come up with all of the projects and programs that are needed for the recovery. But we also want to take those out and vet them with the community and get the whole community involved and find out if there's any priorities that were missed, and any issues that are not being addressed. For instance, there was in one of our workshops, a rancher came in and was distraught because the grazing lands that he used to use were gone. And so he had to ship his cattle to another area for them to graze, and it's costing him a lot of money. And so that's an issue that people hadn't thought of. And there's things like that that do come up when you have community engagement. And you need the local government support, but again, in a place like Mora County, there's not a lot of capacity in the local government. Since I've only been working there probably less than a year, and they're on their third county manager, and this one's an interim, so yeah, it's difficult. Next slide, please. So we've gone through this with the group, and as you can imagine, with 40 or 50 people, getting to one vision isn't easy, but I'm always amazed at how a disaster can galvanize a community, and how you can, even though people have disparate views about what needs to be done or what should be done or how it's impacted them, when it comes to the community, we can get some consensus on, you know, where we are now, where we're going, where do we want to be, and, you know, how do we get there? And there's a lot of projects that are just bubbling to the surface that everyone agrees on, one of which is the need for affordable housing. And so we're working to flesh out all those projects and bring them together in a cohesive and consistent and sustainable plan for the future for the community. Next slide, please. These are just some of the questions that we ask and that come up when you're trying to come up with a common vision, and how we work through these different issues and try to get people to have a consensus on where they're going or what they want to be. Next slide, please. So you know, as I said, once you get the vision and once you have an idea of the priorities and issues, then you have to define the projects and programs that are going to get you there. I like this quote from Nelson Mandela: "Vision without action is just a dream. Action without vision just passes the time. And vision with action can change the world." You need action plans for implementing programs and projects that are needed for recovery. And that's a big part of what we try to help communities do. Next slide. These are the kinds of questions that, you know, you need to consider. Oh, next slide, sorry. The kinds of questions you need to consider when you're working on your projects and programs. And this is how we get to where we flesh out the projects for the community. Next slide, please. And this just shows you, you know, we try to involve everyone in the community. When I was in St. John the Baptist Parish in for FEMA, working on a recovery strategy, we had to go. It was a small rural county, 45,000 total population, but the population was spread out. There was a main town, and there were some small unincorporated areas outside of that. And we held meetings in all of those areas. We held meetings at senior centers. We even had a workshop session with high school students. So we try to get out, and we worked with church groups as well, and involve everyone and get their feedback on what the issues are and whether or not the projects that we're working on are the ones that are going to help solve the problems and issues that they have and what their priorities are. Next slide, please. I used to use a phrase that when I worked for FEMA, we would parachute in, almost literally, because we'd fly in from all over the country into community. And on the run, we'd have to do all these things, identify the stakeholders, know what the political situation was, learn what it was. And the most important thing that we do in a community is listen, because we're not there to tell them what to do. We're there to help them figure out what they need to do to meet their needs and priorities. And, that's the way I was trained to work from the ground up. And, when you do organize the whole community, you get community buy-in, you develop consensus, you empower people to make decisions, and you also find a lot of, like I said, people that with knowledge and experience and understanding of certain issues that are totally unique to the area, and they want to contribute. So you get manpower that you didn't know existed. And it's just really encouraging to have people get in and take local ownership of the process and the programs. And you really need that, because if you don't have champions for projects and programs at the local level, after FEMA leaves and after the state shuts down, then things are just going to die out. So you have to have those champions that are going to push for those things to be implemented, be way beyond what FEMA and the state do in a disaster. Next slide. So as I said, the outcomes are you build community consensus, you're better prepared to seek funding, and the community becomes stronger and less vulnerable if you're successful in implementing these sustainable and mitigating projects and programs in a community. And this is what, next slide, please. And this is what I was talking about, owners or leaders of projects, people that are going to champion the whole effort down the road. And finding the right partners and the right funding. And that's the other thing that we used to do at FEMA and that we do at RCAC, is for all the projects and programs that we help the community identify, we also research and find funding sources that can help implement those projects, because without those resources, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's another issue that I've been fighting with, is the federal government and the state governments are always talking about getting better access for rural and indigenous communities to resources, but there's so many barriers. We recently were trying to help the Dry Creek Rancheria tribe in Northern California get mitigation planning funds from FEMA through the state. And after a long, arduous process where they kept asking for more and more information, they finally told us, well, you're not really eligible to apply for the tribe. And we didn't get the funding. And it's like, the tribe doesn't have the capacity to apply. They don't have the capacity to plan. And they come to us and ask us to help them. And then the state tells us we can't do it. So recently, the state came back to the tribe and told them a way that might work, because I think their quota of helping tribal nations was down. So they're trying to get more. And this is past the deadline for the applications. So they're really desperate, but we'll see what happens there. It's just the access to resources when you don't have the capacity is a daunting task. And that's why, that's one of the main reasons that we got involved with this in the first place, was the board saw that and realized that we could help people. Next slide, please. So that's my story. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. PG&E? Yes, PG&E was found to be liable for the Camp Fire and the Dixie Fire, and I think one other fire. And they've reached settlements and they've set up a trust, but it's almost worse than FEMA, because it's been so slow in coming out. And because PG&E went bankrupt, their stock went down, and the stock was supposed to be part of feeding the trust. So they're actually losing money out of the trust. So they're really slow in trying to get the money out. No, it was just part of the settlement. Well, no, I mean, they hadn't, I don't think it was that. The question was, did they strategize that that the stock would be part of the trust, but I think that just came out of the settlement, and I don't think it was that nefarious that because they went bankrupt and their stock went down. So yeah. Right. Yeah. Um, we, I mean, we don't have psychologists on staff. The question was what people are traumatized after a disaster and what do we do when we come in? One of the things that we, because of my knowledge and other people's knowledge of programs and resources, there's FEMA has crisis management grants, crisis services, through the um, HHS, the Health and I forget Health and Human Services. Thank you, administration, and they can bring in crisis counselors into an area, and we I gave Maui, the folks in Maui, that advice that they go after those crisis counseling dollars to get some crisis managers in there. And also FEMA also has grants for case managers to help people rebuild, and go through the application processes and find other resources, because one thing about FEMA is they're not going to make anyone whole. The max FEMA grant to an individual or family is about $35,000. And that also has to go for temporary housing if they put you up in a hotel or an apartment or whatever. So by the time you get to rebuilding, there might not be a lot left. And not everybody gets that max grant. So FEMA is not going to make you whole. And if you don't have really good insurance, um, you're going to be really hurting after a disaster. Right. Well, yeah, you can reapply for grants, but eventually that is going to run out. So the only hope, and like I said, that's why I said all disasters begin and end locally, is that people get some hope from rebuilding and work together towards that. And well, in Paradise, they had a hospital that burned down, or actually it didn't burn down, it had a lot of smoke damage. And the hospital decided not to rebuild. And that was one of the reasons there were so many seniors in Paradise. They made up a large portion of the population, but they're not coming back because the hospital's not coming back. So, there are impacts that happen like that you can't foresee. And the only way you can work on that is if that's an identified need and you work towards getting something to replace those needs that were there before. Yes. Yeah, well, for one thing, they undergrounded all the utilities in Paradise is number one. And secondly, um, what they should have done, and what they started doing after that, was they do shut down the electric outs. Yeah, yeah. But when there's high winds and wildfire risks, then they start shutting down the electricity in certain areas. And that's one of the things that's happening in Maui, is they're blaming the electric utility company for the fire in Maui because of down power lines. and not shutting off the power in the high wind situation, which was caused by a hurricane 500 miles offshore. Sir. Yeah. Well, uh, yeah. The question was, there are restrictions imposed on property owners, and they get stuck with a bill, and then they find out that their property, a bunch of trees were taken off of their property, and they don't even know what happened to the lumber. Inspections and adherence to the codes are really an important part of the mitigation process. And the town of Paradise got a grant to beef up their inspector corps for at least a couple, 3 years. But they're going to have to find, again, a way to keep that up over a long-term period. And, you know, like I said, property maintenance or keeping those ladder fuels down on especially vacant or abandoned properties is really an issue for the town and for the area. So, and that's why we're also looking at what in Paradise, what the mechanism for implementing those buffer zones would be. Do we need a special district? Do we need a wildfire improvement district? Do we need, you know, will the Parks and Recs district be able to handle that workload without the resources that they're going to need? Or what are where are the resources going to come from? We're looking at a potential tax or fee for property owners to pay in to, you know, get that risk reduction. And they're not going to want to do that unless there's two things, unless there's a match from the state for the funding on an ongoing basis, which the legislature is working on. And if the risk reduction causes enough insurance savings, that makes it worthwhile. So those are the two big issues that we have to work on in this next phase. Yes. Yeah, we would like to be able to do some pre-disaster planning. I'm a big advocate. One of the last things I was working on before I left FEMA was we were working with Baton Rouge to develop a pre-disaster recovery plan. So in other words, get the systems and the organization identified so that and Baton Rouge, they knew another disaster was coming. So that when disaster hit, they could hit the ground running and have everything ready for recovery. And, you know, preparation is another thing. One of the other duties that I have is our housing counseling training folks hold a summit for housing counseling agencies every year. And HUD has insisted that disaster related information be part of that. So I do a disaster preparedness and recovery session for housing counseling agencies and what they can do to prepare their own agency, to prepare their clients, and be better prepared in case of an emergency, but also what they can do on the back end for recovery. Because, as I said, there's grants from FEMA for case management, but I've seen situations where case managers after a disaster have like 200 clients per manager, and that's unwieldy. And so if housing counseling agencies can do that same kind of work for their clients after a disaster, then that would reduce the load on those other case managers. So coordinating with groups that are working on recovery after a disaster, that kind of stuff. And I just recently did that training for the housing counseling agency in Hawaii, remotely, but we're doing a lot of technical assistance behind the scenes for them, and hopefully we'll get some resources. That's the other thing, is whether or not we have the resources to do what you're talking about. So, but there are FEMA funds for preparedness planning, emergency response planning, mitigation planning, and I even think you can get money for recovery planning, pre-disaster recovery planning, because that's what we did in Baton Rouge. So. Well, it's funny. Oh God, 2 years ago, I was giving advice to the Disaster Housing Task Force here in Oregon about FEMA issues and stuff like that. But we didn't get directly involved. I was just doing that on an ad hoc basis. And we have a good contingency of folks here in Oregon. As a matter of fact, our housing director lives here in Portland. One of our folks who's a TAP, technical assistance provider for water and wastewater, he was tapped by a community to help with FEMA applications, something he had never done before. And he quickly learned what was needed and helped them successfully apply for FEMA for help. And I use that. Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's all reimbursement. So, you have to have all your ducks in a row. And I use that as an example for our organization, that whether we want to do it or not, it's coming our way. And we need to be better organized and approach it in a proactive way. Yeah. Yeah. The question was, how does RCAC get initiated into disaster recovery? Or first of all, we don't do response because we're not equipped to do that. Response is like life safety, and that's like immediately after. But yeah, if we're invited in, we won't just show up. We got to be invited in. We get referrals and we get requests for assistance. We have a website where you can go in and request assistance, and then we have to look for resources to be able to help. Yeah. Uh, we we help look for resources. The question was, in Southern Oregon, and it happens in California too, there's undocumented residents that are impacted by disaster, and is there anything RCAC does? You know, we have so many partners and agencies across the country that deal with issues like that, and we know where some of the resources are, and we identify those resources, but we don't have the resources ourselves to deal with that issue specifically. But we point, when we don't have resources or we don't have the knowledge, we point people towards it. Anything online? No. Yes. Well, the way the models just take data that we know and run it through. We do different scenarios, like we do a no action scenario, like a full compliance scenario, and that's where we came up with that 80% reduction in that first go around. And now, like I said, we're going to apply the fire pathways model in the beginning, and determine, you know, how much, based upon future development within the town and where it's going to be, how that can impact risk reduction on an annual basis. And we've got the companies that I mentioned are some of the really heavy hitters in the insurance industry nationwide. So hopefully they'll have some influence. The other big issue in California anyway is reinsurance. You know, insurance companies buy insurance from reinsurance companies, and so that they have a stop loss point, and then the reinsurance company picks up after that stop loss point. In California, the insurance commission and state law does not allow insurance companies to charge their clients for that reinsurance cost. And that's been a big issue. And that's one of the reasons so many insurance companies are leaving California, is because the risk is too high and they can't, you know, it was estimated recently that insurance companies, because of all the wildfires, have lost the last 26 years worth of profit in the last 5 years. I'm not crying for the insurance companies, but yeah, it is. It's unsustainable, right? But if we can help reduce the risk, then yeah. Well, thank you all. I hope you learned something.